Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for watching on June 4th, Wednesday morning. I'm Matt Reardon. There's a few things I want to cover in this video here to start. One, we have this kind of weak trough centered across the central U.S., but I think more important than that is actually this clockwise spin. In fact, I'll point it out right now, this clockwise spinning subtropical ridge over Mexico, which is going to be strengthening and moving toward the northeast. And that's going to have an impact on where we're seeing the focus for severe weather this week. We'll look at that. Then I want to kind of translate that into a conversation on the tropics. We've talked about how mid-June we could see this kind of renewed tropical storm, maybe hurricane development in the eastern Pacific and the western Atlantic. We've already seen tropical storm Alvin this year in the Pacific and how that can affect our forecast. We'll need to keep an eye on some new systems should they develop. After that, if you'll let me, I kind of want to play devil's advocate for a bit here and paint something of a worst case scenario for July in terms of a large ridge developing across the Midwest. There has been this drier shift in the forecast seasonally, just big picture in 2025 and the growing season. And I want to almost kind of put on the bulletin board what we'd have to watch for, looking at history as a guide for that kind of worst case scenario in July. As we go through June here, right, as we paint this forecast and we see how these trends have developed, what are we watching for things that we'd have to be concerned about? So we'll look at that. We'll tie that in with some of the forecast ideas that we're seeing as we get further into June and July as well. So you can skip to the kind of end of this video if you want to see that conversation. As far as what weather we're seeing now, well, this weak trough centered across the central U.S. Our kind of cheat sheet as meteorologists as well. Underneath these troughs, we typically have a little bit cooler air. Underneath the ridges, one here over the central and eastern U.S., one here over Mexico, we tend to have warmer conditions and temperatures. And if we just look at the current temperatures here this morning at about the recording of this video, 7 a.m. Central, right, cooler temperatures waking up this morning underneath the influence of that trough, 40s here over portions of the Central Plains. Outside of that, we're looking at warmer conditions. Now, that trough has already influenced the weather over the central U.S., bringing some rains, precipitation, and some severe reports. If we look at the unfiltered Storm Prediction Center reports just yesterday, you see some of that activity over Missouri, northern Illinois, and then the southern plains as well, portions near Oklahoma City, which actually recorded a brief tornado yesterday. If we look at the radar here this morning, I'm letting this play kind of further through the overnight because the storms weakened here in through last night, but lingering showers, the remnants of yesterday's thunderstorms still persisting over Illinois, southern Missouri. See some of that activity over the southern plains, and then Florida, a state that has needed the rainfall. They have been in some significant drought classifications here this spring, getting some of that precip this year. And then I want to mention the Southwest, some anomalous precipitation getting in here. June is very much not their wet season. This is well before when we expect the monsoon. Part of that is remnant moisture from Tropical Storm Alvin, but we also have a cutoff low that's been helping to organize some of that remnant moisture just to the west of the state of Arizona. We actually saw some of this thunderstorm activity get all the way into Southern California yesterday. Again, rare for June. Some of this pushing slowly, if you'll see it creeping down the elevation here in Arizona toward the Phoenix metro area, which is right about there. Actually seeing some shower activities, not common in June. I can tell you that. Some of that continuing here today. If we just look at the last 48 hours of precipitation, I bring this map up. Florida, they needed the rain and got it. Portions of central Nebraska, they needed the rain, and we saw that here this week. Portions of western and west central Iowa, areas that needed moisture, has seen it this week. I say that I'll include northern Illinois, that there are always holes, right? There are the haves and have-nots. So I can get in here and scrutinize some areas that we'll have to watch going forward if we return to heat and drought. They're going to pop up with some of those soil moisture deficits, just being frank. We'll have to see how this activity shifts into Illinois and Indiana, because that, what I'll call the I-80 drought, I'm comfortable calling it that at this point. That dryness lingers all the way over here into the central Corn Belt. And we can just see that looking at the NASA estimated soil moisture values. We pull these up pretty often, and it highlights those hot spots, those areas to keep an eye on that continue to lack some of the moisture in the soil profile. Drought Monitor kind of concurs with some of that as well. We see those drought classifications that have stayed elevated in that kind of I-80 zone here as we've gone through spring. Despite some of this precipitation, these areas have had rainfall. They've had some frequent rainfall events. It just hasn't been these soaking rains that have piled up into the year-to-date accumulations at this point. Jump over and look at the all hazards map here as of this morning. I typically see a big gray blob like that over a number of counties, and I think fog in the morning, but that is not fog across portions of Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa. It's actually, unfortunately, an air quality alert. So we've seen those fires and the smoke from Canada. We've talked about those. A lot of that smoke has stayed, well above our head. Florida, there are pictures of, a red sunset. Again, that smoke staying out of the air that we breathe for the most part, but it's starting to now push in at the surface, unfortunately, to the upper Midwest and bringing those air quality indices up and folks trying to stay indoors as a result of that. Flood watches and a few flood warnings over here into the southwest. That is consistent with that rainfall we saw there. Some of that activity shifting toward the northeast over the Four Corners today, and some flood watches, advisories, and warnings lingering across portions of Texas, Missouri, eastern Nebraska as well, with all the precipitation they've had this spring and then here recently. Now, I want to show quickly, this is the 500 millibar high pattern from the ECM to BIF. I bring this up, let's bring this up about 7 a.m. here, there's Central Time. Because you can see that weak ridge here centralized across portions, maybe Kansas, Nebraska, and South Dakota. There's that cutoff low bringing that precipitation into the southwest as well. And there's that ridge, right, that I mentioned at the beginning of this video. And I really want you, there's going to be a lot going on in this as I just take this, let's do 72 hours out. But keep an eye on this ridge here as I go through Wednesday, now Thursday morning, 7 a.m., now Friday morning, 7 a.m., let's just do that. Let's just take it 48 hours out. So that ridge has now broadened. It's moved over Texas. It's much wider. And so while this trough has weakened here across the central U.S., it's moved east a bit. This ridge has not weakened. It's gotten stronger. And the jet stream level flow between this Thursday and Friday is going to increase. And we're going to see some severe weather and thunderstorm activity follow along that corridor here. That kind of sets us up for where we're going to see precipitation, thunderstorms, and lingering development. This trough here over the northern part of the country, if I kind of spoil the forecast a little bit, if I take it into the future, we see it combined with a piece out of Canada, keeping lingering cold temperatures over the Midwest as we get through this weekend. We'll take a look at that in a second after we talk about some of the thunderstorms over the next 72 hours. I'm going to update this 3-kilometer NAM forecast. This is a forecast of the simulated radar. Let's make it valid. So let's do it again. Recording this video 7 a.m. There's those lingering showers across portions of the Midwest, that activity over Florida, lingering activity over Texas, and then over the southwest. So take this forecast until lunchtime. Now 4 p.m. Central Time, you can see additional activity here over the Four Corners, additional thunderstorm activity, likely sub-severe over the southeast, but waiting for renewed storm development, kind of along a line from what I'll call the Arklatex area, that is Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas, up through the Midwest, Indiana, into southern Michigan, storm development all the way up into Ontario and Canada. And that moves through this evening, 8 p.m., continuing to see thunderstorm development across portions of central Illinois, getting into northern Illinois times. Some parts in northern Indiana needing more rainfall, needing moisture along I-80, getting that overnight tonight. That activity pushing into Thursday morning. And you'll notice the rainfall that was focused over Florida, just kind of over the next 24 to 36 hours, is going to be coalescing more so over the Carolinas and then just off the coast. Actually so much that the National Hurricane Center has started to catch its attention here. We'll take a look at that in a few slides. So we go through Thursday afternoon. The thunderstorm activity that was on a line here, just here today, is now shifting east. On Thursday, seeing some shower development here over portions of South Dakota, Nebraska, Iowa, southwest Minnesota. Not expecting terribly too much accumulations from this, but it is something. We'll have to see how much falls as we go through the day Thursday. But really into Thursday night, waiting for more proper severe thunderstorm development over in the panhandle of Oklahoma and Texas. Some of this could coalesce into a wind threat overnight, Thursday night into Friday. You can see how quickly that ramps up and organizes. This is late Thursday into Friday morning. And at this time, that ridge is really positioning over Texas now, and that jet stream is just flowing right over the top of these systems. And so as we get into Friday afternoon, this forecast ends at 1 p.m., but with that jet stream cranking between the two, would definitely expect renewed severe thunderstorm development along a line like this through portions of the Mid-South. We'll take a look at that in a moment. If we look at the Day 1 Storm Prediction Center outlook, there's that long line just today. Michigan, right, into Ontario, through northwest Ohio, into Indiana, central Illinois, all the way through that Arklatex area, and then renewed development along the panhandle of Texas today. We see more of that tomorrow, again, waiting on Thursday for some renewed development, potentially a stronger complex moving through central Oklahoma overnight, and a lingering development on the line all the way up into Maine, stretching through the Corn Belt, through the Mid-South, and then all the way over toward the Southern Plains tomorrow on Thursday. And then Friday, look, underneath that ridge in East Texas. No thunderstorms expected. That trough over Canada, but between the two, the jet stream cranking, potential renewed severe development in the Mid-South as we go through the day Friday. Now, the Storm Prediction Center doesn't always do this, but with confidence high enough, they have put out a risk area for Saturday over portions of the southeast. So again, with that jet stream flowing over the top of June moisture, the likelihood of severe weather continues on Saturday. Take this jet stream forecast out. I'm going to take it to Friday evening. So there's that ridge over Texas that we talked about in Mexico, that jet stream flowing quickly between the two. If I play this forecast into Saturday afternoon, you can see that shifting ever so slightly south, and we saw that storm prediction center activity shift south. But we also see a stronger trough now pushing into Saskatchewan. There we go, on Wednesday morning. That's moving in here, Manitoba as well. And that's going to make its presence felt this weekend. Now, Sunday, as that trough situates over the Midwest, we'll see shower activity kind of lingering around this. Again, precipitation accumulations with something coming from the north to the south like that, not expecting too significant, but we will see some showers out of this. But really the news is that going through this weekend into early next week, that kind of lingering cold temperatures, that lingering cold that we saw in May is unfortunately returning to portions of the Midwest and then the eastern U.S. as a result of this trough. But the ridging that's developing across the west is going to bring temperatures up in a big way. That trough continues to spin next week, and it's really later into the week where we see more ridging developing across portions of the central U.S. and potentially heat values rising. If we look at the ECMWF forecast over the next kind of 6 to 7 days, I'll take this valid as of this morning. So there's that lingering activity we talked about over the middle part of the country. So I take it into tonight and then into tomorrow. Let's do Thursday. This is 1 p.m. Thursday. Again, that line here extending through portions all the way up into Maine. We looked at that. Potential development back over in the panhandle of Texas, the showers that we talked about pushing into South Dakota and Nebraska. Late Thursday into very early Friday morning, some of that activity lingering over western Minnesota, eastern South Dakota, and then potentially more strong severe storm development over portions of the panhandle, Oklahoma. We see that pushing through now Friday afternoon, right? That wide storm prediction center risk area like this, but more so kind of focused on the mid-south here, areas like Tennessee, Kentucky, Arkansas, Mississippi, northern Alabama. And then as I take this in through Saturday and Saturday afternoon, again, kind of highlighting the potential for thunderstorm development and a severe threat here over portions of the southeast. So I take the forecast into Sunday, the influence of that trough now showing up again in the form of showers, potentially some weak thunderstorms out of this as this moves down northwest to southeast across the Midwest. But as I take this forecast forward into Tuesday of next week with that ridging developing behind it, seeing this area increasingly go over dry in the trend next week. So there's Wednesday as well. And then Thursday, starting to see something of potentially a next system moving through the northern plains or the Midwest Thursday or Friday of next week. And I actually think I'm going to make the argument that a potential tropical storm or hurricane development could help our chances of getting rainfall into here. We'll take a look at that in a minute. Kind of the bigger conversation with that trough pushing out of Canada into the Midwest this weekend is going to be those temperatures. So surface temperature maximum today, that is the high temperature forecast, cooler over portions of the central U.S. and then through the Midwest underneath that shower activity, underneath the storms over the southeast, cooler. Let's take this forecast Friday, now Saturday and Sunday. See those cooler temperatures shifting off into the Midwest and then the eastern U.S. and then temperatures picking up in a big way behind that as that ridge develops out west. Boise, areas in central Washington over towards Spokane, eastern Oregon, getting up into the 90s, maybe even triple digits as we go into Sunday. Monday, still seeing lingering cold temperatures over the Midwest and then the east. That continues on Tuesday, but finally Tuesday with that ridging broadening out across the central U.S., not just the west, seeing those warm temperatures finally spread back into the northern plains as we get into kind of the middle to late part of next week. If we look backwards in time, this is a 15-day average temperature anomalies going all the way backwards through the end of May. I bring this up because this area has been cool. Now we've got brief warm-ups. We're going to see a brief warm-up next week as well. But the cooler temperatures this weekend means that a lot of these areas in here, even getting into the Mid-South, are running GDD deficits. Actually, technically year to date, all the way back to January 1st. But if you start some of these GDDs as to May 1st, when some of these crops started emerging, these are looking at cooler temperatures now averaged all the way through early June here and then through this weekend with that trough moving in. So we can rebound with some heat in June, but it's something of a story to keep an eye on as we go through the early part of this growing season. If we look at the 5-day precipitation anomaly, a lot of this activity we're seeing here today over portions of the Midwest. But again, that kind of backwards U that I've mentioned at times this spring still kind of, I shouldn't say backwards U, I should just say a U. Portions over kind of the continental divide, the four corners through the southern U.S., into the southeast and the mid-Atlantic, the 7-day precipitation anomalies, and starting to see a drier swath set up in here, anywhere from the Canadian Prairie all the way into the American Midwest. As we get out into the 4 to 10-day outlook, renewed low pressure system development is possible late next week. We're seeing some of that activity now out to the 4 to 10-day forecast from the ECMWF. But if we just keep this a full 10-day precipitation anomaly outlook, some areas in here lingering with some dry concerns getting in through mid-June. I'll take a look at that in a moment. I'm going to show you, this is the forecast from the ECMWF AIFS, and I bring this up because I did mention that hurricane conversation just a few slides ago. I'm going to make this forecast go well into the weekend here, and just off screen, it's hard to see, but there's actually a weak tropical storm developing here on the AIFS, and that's going to continue to development, but it takes it west, well out of our area of purview. So as that goes west, I always say, if you show me a hurricane, I'll show you a ridge. So as that goes west, watch this subtropical ridge that we've been talking about. I mentioned it was moving over Texas here at the end of this week. But it's going to follow it west. And I'll just play this forecast forward. We're all the way Thursday, now Friday of next week. Did you see that? That ridge, right? This was all the way over here in Texas, has been walked like a dog all the way over toward Hawaii. And what that has allowed all the way Saturday of next week, that's June 14th, for some troughing, weak troughing to move into the central U.S. And this would undoubtedly bring precipitation chances back to portions of Iowa, Illinois, maybe even the northern plains, portions of the mid-south as well. And so the hurricane development here actually helped to kind of clear the road for our systems late next week. It's kind of neat to see that. So when I look at the ECMWF AIFS 7-day forecast, there's the 10-day forecast. But if I take you all the way out 8 to 14 days, that is the 12th through the 18th, seeing renewed precipitation development across the middle part of the country. So the ECMWF ENS also kind of has that same phenomenon. I'll play this forward. Again, not looking at anything too specific. There's that development here in the Eastern Pacific, and there's that ridge getting walked to the west, and that leaves the door open. If I take this forecast back to Saturday, Thursday, June 12th, again, ridging here over the east, but at least some troughing now getting into the western U.S. And if I take this forecast over and show you the ECMWF ENS 7-day precipitation anomalies, there's that dry area that we were concerned about over the Canadian Prairie and through the Midwest, 10-day, but 8 to 14-day, seeing some precipitation now move back into the area here. I think what we're also seeing is MJO effects. So we typically don't focus so much on the Madden-Julian oscillation as we get into summer because it tends to be weaker. But when it's moving quickly like this, it tends to affect our pattern. So as it's gone from phases 5, now 6 today, into 7, and then potentially 8 into mid-June, that's right along the time that we're expecting that renewed tropical development in the Eastern Pacific. We just saw the potential implications on our forecast there getting into late next week. And as we take this forecast forward, and we think about mid-June into late June, what we typically see with these MJO transitions through the Pacific is that after they come through and they extend the Pacific jet stream and they kind of move things through, they can tend to give way. What I mean by that is they tend to kind of release their energy, if you will, and that tends to fold up into a trough across the western U.S. and ridging over the central or the eastern U.S. We see that time and time again in winter. It's a less reliable signal in summer, but it can still exist, and I think we're seeing that a bit. So with the National Hurricane Center showing a potential development here in the Eastern Pacific, and that's likely to continue here, so they have a greater than 60% chance of development. In fact, if we look at this, up to now 70% chance of cyclone development in 7 days. This is the one that would likely move to the west and help usher that ridge to the west and help bring some troughing back into the central U.S. in mid-June. Now, this is a product of the MJO moving across the Pacific into the Eastern Pacific. That's helping to bring those tropical storm development chances there. I'm rooting for this development. I want to see more precipitation chances get into the central U.S. if we are going to eventually have a so-called dry summer, right? So I'm watching the National Hurricane Center closely with this forecast here. Even though this storm is undoubtedly highly unlikely to impact land directly, the chance of it making it over to Hawaii is very, very low. National Hurricane Center is not ignoring the Atlantic. We mentioned those thunderstorms kind of coalescing around Florida. As those move up toward the northeast, there's actually a chance those could develop into a weak tropical storm at some point here this weekend. The forecast would probably quickly take that to the east thereafter, but it is interesting that that would be one way to get our first storm of the year. It would be pretty unique in early June. If we look over here this morning, we do have sunrise. We are able to see some of those showers spinning over Florida here if I take you to the radar. And see those spinning. So that activity moving toward the northeast over the next few days, and the tropical storm potential will increase with that. All that being said, still looking pretty low. The chance of that forming a storm down to 10% at this point from the ECMWF, or from the National Hurricane Center, I should say. Speaking of the ECMWF, I want to pull up the ensemble forecast. This is the probabilities of reaching an inch or more precipitation, and I'm going to play this forecast because it's we're just going to take that probability out into the future. So as I take this into the next 24 hours, underneath those showers and thunderstorms over Florida and the Midwest, seeing those precipitation values climb, and then those probabilities along with that. So take this through the weekend, right? Your chance of achieving 1 inch or more, increasing pretty steadily across portions of the eastern U.S., portions of the Mid-South, definitely near the Carolinas. As I take this into next week, Wednesday, now Thursday, we can see the areas, right, where we're expecting to get significant precipitation. But areas that are potentially missing out, Iowa over into Nebraska, the Dakotas up into the Canadian Prairie. This takes us up to Thursday of next week. And it's the end of next week, right? When I mentioned that potential ushering out of that ridge, that pushing in of a trough here into the central U.S. could bring some renewed precipitation development at the end of next week. We see that activity here from the Canadian Prairie down through the north central U.S. But there are some areas in here that's far enough out in the forecast that we'll have to keep an eye on, especially along I-80. That's keeping, that drought has reared its head a few times now this spring. If we look at the 6 to 10 day outlook from the Climate Prediction Center, this is really getting set into the next work week. Cooler temperatures under the influence of that trough coming out of Canada across the Midwest. Again, those GDP deficits continue to pile up here across portions of the Midwest, but the heat coming in a big way next week for the western U.S. We looked at those high temperatures here just as early as this weekend over portions of Washington, Boise, and Oregon. Precipitation values, there's that U that we've talked about this year with precipitation over the south, along the central high plains, into the southern high plains, Texas, over into Florida, and the mid-Atlantic as well, but keeping an eye on this area in between for increased dryness next week. So take this out into mid-June, the 8 to 14 day outlook. I mentioned that as those MJO transits occur, they tend to bring systems through, bring precipitation. We're seeing that, but as they fold backwards, we tend to see troughing in the west, seeing some of that show up here in the 8 to 14 day outlook and ridging over the central U.S., so mid-June. Seeing some potential for that as we get out further into the forecast. If we look at the 8 to 14 day precipitation outlook, with that troughing that moves in next week into the potential western end of the central U.S. at times, seeing that potential redevelopment of Canadian Prairie precipitation chances. Continuing across the south, we'll have to see how much of that gets in to the Midwest and the central U.S. That ridging coming over the top will bring the heat back in. We'll see if we can get some precipitation as well underneath it. So I want to jump over and kind of shift this conversation. I mentioned at the beginning this kind of, if you'll let me be devil's advocate here, I want to paint kind of a worst case scenario for July and what we'd have to watch for. I mentioned that MJO transit coming through in June and how as that comes through and as that goes through phases 8 through the Pacific and kind of flips back, I called it folding back at times, we tend to see those troughs over the western U.S., right, in the ridging over the central U.S., just all else equal. Typically in winter, but if the activity is strong enough in summer, we see it there again as well. Now to set this conversation up, I want to show you this. This is a climate classification across the globe. And there's a number of different ways to do this. I'm not going to go into each kind of classification, but the important point of bringing this up is that there are kind of two belts of precipitation across the globe. One is across the equator. This is your kind of tropical rainforest rainfall, if you will. So the Central African rainforest over into the Amazon, Indonesia, we call this the maritime continent. Plenty of precipitation across the equator. Now in the northern and far southern regions near the poles, we have the boreal forest, which gets plenty of precipitation. This is what maybe you could call your kind of temperate rainforest in some areas. In other areas, it is your more typical kind of northern woods. But we see a lot of precipitation in the northern areas here. The southern hemisphere doesn't have a lot of kind of far south land to kind of see that same kind of climate classification, but you could think of Chile getting down further south, some of the temperate rainforest they have there at the end of the continent. Now, between the two is the subtropics, the horse latitudes, or kind of your global deserts. And I'll kind of draw that latitude quickly here, stretching across. In between the equator and the polar regions, we have our horse latitudes. Now, I just drew two separate ones. I drew the northern hemisphere and then the southern hemisphere ones. And you'll notice that in those horse latitudes, the atmosphere likes to produce deserts. We have the Saharan Desert, the Arabian Desert, we have portions of the Middle East that are very dry. And then over into the North America, the Western Hemisphere, we have the Sonoran Desert as well, portions of northern Mexico, which are very dry. And the Southern Hemisphere, right, Australia, portions of the Namibian Desert, and then portions of the Atacama Desert in South America, along with Patagonia, a few others. Now, we are here and we actually live in the United States, and there's some other areas, China included, portions of Southeast China, that are actually kind of near, if not in, those subtropical desert latitudes. The reason that we're not painted red in this area here is because we have the Gulf of Mexico, we have a north-south running mountain chain, and when we blow jet stream level winds across that, we tend to yank air from the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic up into this area, and we storm all summer long. China has a similar phenomenon. They have high elevations to their west, the MJO front that runs along an area like this through southeast China. They're able to pull tropical moisture up from the Pacific, and they rain quite a bit here in southeast China, and they grow a wide variety of crops here up into the North China Plain and the Manchurian Plain as well. But it is for geographic kind of coincidences that we're able to bring precipitation into areas here that we otherwise would not be if we just let the atmosphere do what it wanted to over kind of a broad area with no mountains. And the reason I bring that up is because there are times when this part of North America can revert back into that default state where it kind of forgets about the mountain chain to its west, and it remembers that, well, I'm still at times in the subtropics and I'm in the summer going to behave like a desert. And it does that when we lose that flow over the Rocky Mountains, to put it simply. When that flow weakens and it goes up over into Canada, we tend to build a ridge somewhere over the central west, either in the Midwest, Southern Plains, or the central west. And there are brief moments in summer where that can dominate and for a time make it feel, like we're in a desert. And it occurs when we lose that flow. And so you'll see Eric and I always focusing on where is that momentum and flow coming from. And it typically comes from the West Pacific. We've talked about that a few times this spring. If we just look at where the momentum typically comes from the atmosphere, where it breathes, it's over here in the West Pacific near that maritime continent in Indonesia. Now, I specifically pulled this up from June to August. This is looking at ascent in the upper levels of the atmosphere as a proxy for where we're seeing convection and activity to spur that momentum forward. And what we're seeing that is here, and that kicks off in summer the jet stream and brings it across enough of those elevations, the Rocky Mountains to our west, to pull that moisture up into the eastern U.S. and allow us to grow a crop. But there are times when this gets impacted by a number of things, whether it's La Nina or otherwise, where this weakens, the flow exits up over Canada, and we build a big ridge into the middle part of the country. And if that persists for a long time in July, well, it can turn into yield-robbing drought. And so it's why we try to connect these things and put together a forecast for July. And as I was doing this yesterday, I found some scenarios to watch out for, and I'll paint these quickly here. One, I mentioned that is these MJO transits from phase 6, 7, 8, that is through the Pacific, and then kind of walks back toward the Indian Ocean and Africa in phases 1, 2, and 3. That would be over here on this map. And I know it's kind of hard to see the continents here. Here's North America, here's Europe, here's Asia, Africa, and South America kind of at the bottom of this map here. And so what I did is I took this climatology of MJO phases in the summer, along with the trough and ridge pattern that most often occurred with them, and I took it out to July. And I'm going to do that quickly here. And I wanted to find the phases on the left here of the MJO that tended to produce ridging over the middle part of the country, that kind of reverting back to the default state of the atmosphere in the central U.S., if you will. And what I found was phases 1 in July, this is all the way in the middle of July, right during pollination. Phases 1, 2, and 3 tended to produce this persistent ridge over the Midwest and at times the eastern U.S. And even getting on to phase 8, kind of in early July, we saw more of a northern plains, northern Midwest ridge. So phases maybe 8, 1, 2, and 3 in July would be ones to watch out for. So I said, okay, is this true? Can I look back in history and find that holds true? Well, phases kind of 1, 2, and 3, I mentioned over near Africa and the Indian Ocean is where we'd see more of that ascent, not necessarily the maritime continent. And sure enough, I went back to July and August from 2012, 2011, and 1988. I just, on the top of my head, went 3 very hot, warm, and dry Julys in the central part of the country. And sure enough, we did not see that ascent so much over the maritime continent in the West Pacific. It was over here in the Indian Ocean. And so this says to me, well, despite the MJO being of less importance as we go through these summer months, I think it's still something to watch as we get and start painting this July forecast. If the MJO, which is right now in phase, let me pull up where I had that in the forecast. Right now we're transiting through phase 5 and 6. We're heading over into 7 and 8 here as we get into mid-June. We talked about how that's potentially spurring tropical development, hurricane development in the Eastern Pacific. We're kind of rooting for that right now because that's going to move that subtropical ridge out of the way, bringing that troughing into the central U.S. to get some rain into the middle part of the country next week. But as that folds back into phase 1, 2, and 3 here into the latter part of July, that's when we're seeing those ridging showing up in the long-range forecast. This is June 11th to the 17th. In fact, if I take you over to the ENS, the ECMWF ensemble forecast. Let's take you back and we'll do ECMWF ensemble. I want to do North America 500 millibar height anomalies. Forgive me, I'm going to take this forecast out quickly. June 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, as those phases move back to 1, 2, and 3 in the MJO. Interestingly enough, that pattern is holding up, ridging over the Midwest. Now, this is June. In fact, I'd take this now to get some heat units back into the Midwest. But if that same transit and flip occurs in July, there's something to be concerned about, because if we still are lacking some rainfall, whether it's I-80, whether it's areas of the Canadian Prairie, or maybe even some built-in dryness that comes in the next 3 weeks over portions of the central or southern plains, and we see one of these foldbacks to 1, 2, and 3 in July, it's going to be a signal that we're going to watch for heat and drought to build into the area. Now, it's too early to say exactly where we're going to be in that MJO forecast. In fact, if we can try to find where I put that, this can transit across the globe anywhere from 30 to 60 days. It can do this fast or slow at times. It just so happens right now it's moving very quickly. The chances, I think, that it folds back and kind of sits back in phases 4, 5, and 6 in late June and early July are more likely. And that would be good news, I think, to bring some of that momentum, jet stream level flow, and precipitation back to the middle part of the country in very late June or early July. The question would be, if we miss out on that, well, there's this chance that we could start again at some point in July, one of these transits back through the Pacific, folding back into phases 1, 2, and 3 into mid to late July, bringing ridging and heat back to the conversation. And the kind of question, is that going to be yield robbing, depends on what we see in early July. So now I'm kind of putting the cart before the horse a little bit. This is all to say that this is what, I'm not going to ignore this as much as maybe I otherwise would, given the movement that we've seen in here in June, and given that it appears to be a reliable signal both in history and then here at the end of June, lining up with some of these longer-term forecasts. Speaking of those longer-term forecasts, I want to finish up here, jump over and show you the ECMWF forecast. This is a 30-day precipitation anomaly from that ECMWF extended. So this is taking us June 19th to July 19th. I took this out as far as I could. And the ECMWF weeklies here, I've been painting this dry signature across the central and southern plains, getting it over into Iowa and Illinois now at this point. Now, I'm not saying that this is exactly what's going to happen, but it is interesting that when I take that ascent forecast I showed you earlier, that thought experiment, and I take this forecast out into the mid to late part of July, and I see phases 1, 2, and 3 lighting up here and kind of overlapping with that dry signal here over the middle part of the country. So it just so happens that these forecasts are staying consistent with that thought experiment that we just performed, looking at the different MJO phases in July. Something to watch as we go forward here. I've taken up enough of your time here today. Thanks for watching here. I'll talk with you all tomorrow. Might dive deeper into the tropics as we see some of these tropical storms coalesce in development. But until then, thanks for watching.